Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to It's Rainmaking Time. This is Kim Greenhouse. We have the great pleasure today of speaking with Polly Higgins, an international environmental lawyer who has done something that has never been done before. She has created the Planet Earth Trust and a Universal Declaration of Planetary Rights. She is introducing to the United Nations what ecocide is from the planet's point of view. And she has also a declaration of all human beings that unify people, that transcend religion. Polly Higgins is an activist. She loves the earth, and I think she communicates that and bridges that very well with her law practice internationally. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Polly Higgins to It's Rainmaking Time.
Oh, thank you very much, Kim. What a wonderful introduction.
Thank you. Let's talk about what got you to create the People's Declaration and this Planet Earth Trust.
Well, the Planet Earth Trust was, in fact, a reaction to Copenhagen, the climate change negotiations just back in December. I was very aware when I was there, I was invited to input into drafting of suggestions from the people. This was an invite by Bolivia to input into the actual, what was then called the Copenhagen Accord. And as a result, we had 9 hours to put this together. Negotiators have had, I think, 18 years.
Wow.
It was quite remarkable because what I discovered was, at the time, the document was actually over 147 pages long. And I had to kind of crash read it and realize that there was absolutely nothing in it whatsoever that really understood that, in fact, we are trustees of the planet. All it was doing was treating the planet as a commodity.
Exactly.
To trade. And that, to me, was a huge problem, because if we keep on treating the planet as a thing in which we can trade, then we will ultimately end up with conflict wars.
You, I'm sure, have been called upon by people across the world to speak, and I know that you speak all over. You're in the middle of writing a book. What is the book about, and when will it be out?
The book is, in fact, dealing with an awful lot of this. It's specifically dealing with my latest proposal to the United Nations on the international crime of ecocide. The book itself is called Eradicating Ecocide, and it's dealing with the laws and governance to prevent the destruction of the planet. We have in place some laws that really don't work and have evolved over time, sometimes erroneously. And what has happened is that we have an incredible imbalance where we have, this is getting back to the point of commoditizing the planet, we treat the planet as a piece of property, and we've forgotten about how we can use what's called laws of trust, where we become trustees, stewards of the planet. And so it's about really demystifying how law works, so that, everyone can understand what laws are hindering us and what laws help us and what new laws we need.
I was just doing an interview the other day with Rosalind Peterson from agriculturedefensecoalition.org. And it's a very important body of work that she is doing. And I'm sharing this with you because it's very pivotal. For example, I just found out, much to my pain, that the U.S. Navy is literally taking out 11.7 million marine animals over the next 5 years in the United States.
My goodness.
They're doing war experiments on our oceans. Now, it's a very complex thing, as you know, to talk about being a steward of the planet. Wouldn't you say that most individuals who love the planet, revere trees, love birds, appreciate the ocean and the land and clean air, really are pretty good stewards of the planet, but that governments and the military operations in governments do things to this planet? We can outcry, but we have no control to stop them.
This is the huge problem. At the heart of this, we do not have international laws to stop this. And in fact, damage and destruction to the seas is possibly, to my mind, one of the worst forms of ecocide we can have. For instance, what's happening with the Gulf oil spill, because unlike land, we cannot remediate the sea. We cannot take out the damage and the destruction that's been done. You can remediate soils. You can actually, what's called bioremediation. You can grow things to help leach out toxins and to neutralize. But in deep seas, you can't do it. And when you kill species in the seas, it's very hard to monitor just what levels we're at until it's too late, until we know we have a dead sea on our hands. Without laws to stop what actually very few people are doing, ultimately at the end of the day, then we're left in a very unequal balance here. There's a report coming out later this year. It's called the Teeb report, and it puts the damage and destruction to the planet for 2008 at $2.2 trillion globally. And it's a conservative estimate, but it's basically a way of trying to gauge, just how much damage we're doing. That's a huge figure. Only 7 nations' GDPs exceed that figure. The worst thing is that for 2009, it's almost doubled. It's $4 trillion. And in fact, I was reading today that it's now estimated the cost of the Gulf oil spill will be around $1 trillion. So we're looking at, enormous ecocide writ large. And the damage that's been done in the Teeb report, that was analysed as being from 3,000 corporations. So we're seeing the decisions of 3,000 CEOs that are creating disproportionately mass ecocide across the planet, where the majority of the people do not want this to happen.
And that is the dilemma. That's the sensitive dilemma that so many people feel powerless. In other words,
Yes.
We can write. As activists, we can speak. We can go out. We can publish. We can broadcast. But unless there are laws that hold corporations accountable, and it's very much the same old, GMO foods, for example, I just learned, are part of the equation that are killing the bees. The spraying of the air is not only hurting the health of people, the experiments with our air, I'm sure you know what I'm referring to, all of it combined, and they're usually military operations that are going on, and they're projects with corporations that are not accountable to us as people. And until there's laws that hold corporations accountable, what can we do?
Well, this is the biggest problem, and in fact, it really is about inventing new laws to hold corporations and governments, for that matter, to account. And this is where an international crime of ecocide comes into place. The problem is at the moment is that governments, corporations, banks, financial institutions who finance huge projects that are ultimately destructive to the environment don't make the moral connect between putting money into something that's profitable but damaging at the same time. But once you make it a crime to create this damage or destruction or loss of ecosystems on a grand scale, then you'll find that governments will no longer put policies in that support activities that are a crime. Likewise, financial institutions will no longer put money into activities that are a crime because they will become automatically at risk of ending up in court. And it's not a matter of being fined.
Right.
It's a matter of being at risk of going to prison, of being incarcerated. And that is key here. This is absolutely key because if you can't actually use that as the stick to prevent mass ecocide, then ultimately you will always find with corporations they will buy their way out of the problem.
And it's gone on forever. This has also been my own dilemma with doing any type of cap and trade system because really you create a commodity system out of something where people don't have to be responsible for anything. And now, even though you and I may not be on the same page with regard to the role of carbon in the world, There are so many things I am on the same page with you about in your body of work and in your calling, because this is a spiritual commitment. To me, stewardship is spiritual, and you can't disconnect and bifurcate our activities, since all of our activities are impacting everything. But for example, in the United States, NOAA is part of allowing the U.S. Navy plans to decimate 11.7 million marine mammals over the next 5 years. And I'm not a political person, but Obama approved and has the head of Monsanto as his head of agriculture. Yeah. In my view, Polly, people fall in love with and get mesmerized by official leaders. And when you become mesmerized by official leaders, whatever their name, whoever they are, wherever they are, and you don't look into the detail of all of these legal instruments, it's hard to know what's really going on. So I never get mesmerized by any leader's speech. I always look at where are they dwelling? What are they signing? To me, this is not a political issue, but it ends up looking like there is a geopolitical call to do something different. It's not enough that they get fined because they just pay it off and proceed. But I find several things, and as a lawyer, I know I can say this to you, okay? I find several things problematic with what's happened here in the United States. And to me, this is a microcosm. It's just an example of what goes on in many parts of the world. When I looked into what happened here with the Gulf Coast, I did not want to be part of doing any type of media or journalism to just make BP wrong. I didn't want to have that kind of conversation. What I wanted to have a conversation is who's involved? When did they know? Who are the subcontractors? And when you go into it, all these other subcontractors, like Halliburton, Transocean, and others, all have a role in how this came to be. And nobody's accountable. Nobody. Talk about it.
Well, this is absolutely it. It's the failure to actually accept responsibility. And our laws have facilitated that. One of the things I'm addressing in Eradicating Ecocide, my book, is really exposing the laws that have created this situation. And I trace the origins of corporate supremacy to one judicial comment which granted the fictional person, the corporation is a fictional person in legal terms, the same rights as humans. But the biggest problem with that is that, of course, a piece of paper, a charter or an articles of association can never be put in prison. And so when you grant rights to the corporation, you cannot impose responsibilities. So all you can do is fine them. And my belief is that we have to expose the origins of this corporate supremacy and really break it and stop this happening so that the individuals themselves start taking responsibility. Now, there is a way that we can do this. And in fact, it's something that was put in place as an international criminal principle back in 1948 at the Nuremberg war trials.
Talk about it.
That principle is called superior responsibility. And what that means is, and it was determined then, that you could not hide behind either saying that, well, it's the order of others, but more importantly, the more superior you were in an organization, in an army, in a corporation, in a business as well, because certain heads of business were taken to court as well as heads of various generals. And by imputing the principle of superior responsibility, what was determined was that crimes are committed by humans. Therefore, it is humans who must take responsibility. You can't hide behind the entity of an organization. You can't hide behind some form of immunity. And you can't hide behind saying, oh, well, it's only BP over there. It's actually about all those who are in a position of superior responsibility, taking on board, on their shoulders, their duties and their obligations. And once you do that, then you'll have corporations being far more careful about what they decide to do or not to do. Think about it. If you were head of a corporation and you're sitting there with your board of directors and you're saying, okay, let's go in and we'll use the example of
Sure.
drilling. Let's do that. Unfortunately, it's now a crime of ecocide if anything goes wrong. Goodness, that means I could go to prison. Maybe we should investigate clean energy solutions instead. You can see how very quickly people would start to take responsibility for their superior responsibilities the higher they are up in an organization.
Many of the drillers, Polly, knew several weeks before that it was going to blow because they were working with faulty equipment, but they couldn't say anything. I think there's another part of this, which is that people need to be willing to be fired, to leave their jobs, to have faith, to know that other opportunities will open if they don't participate in activities like this. They knew what they were doing.
Well, in fact, this is another aspect that I cover in the book about protecting the eco-whistleblowers. Because, of course, at the moment, we have very little protection for those who do blow the whistle on these things. And recently in the Philippines, certain laws have been brought in to do just that. Really radical laws that allow you, the whistleblower, to go to court and seek an emergency environmental protection order and not have to pay your court costs until the conclusion of the case. And if the case is in your favor, that emergency environmental protection order is put in place, then you won't have to pay your costs. The other side will. Now, that's fantastic. That's very important that that's being done. And there are other rules of procedure that are being put in place as well there to protect against what are called in America, it's known as SLAPs, strategic litigation, that's used against activists or people who stand up to take a stance against what they perceive to be wrong and damaging the environment. And in the Philippines, they've provided protection for people who are prepared to stand up and do that, or are being threatened by big corporations with extensively costly litigation to shut them up. That's effectively being outlawed now, which is just marvelous. We need that right across the world.
I did an interview with this couple in New Mexico who has been in the natural paint business, and they described to me the inner workings of the paint industry. And it's very interesting because if one perceives oneself to be green and a planetary advocate and an environmental advocate, all of that, what they shared with me was so interesting that even though you can slap a green packaging on paint, they talked about regulations in the paint industry. They talked about how the paint industry got away with not really being able to have natural paint so that there's no solvents.
Oh, yeah.
It was so fascinating. They separated the wheat from the chaff. What happens is that the big companies are trying to get in, quote, and ride on the green movement, and they have laws or regulations that allow them to get in under the radar, and they're absolutely not green. They're absolutely not good for people, but they're in.
Well, this is about what I call, and I address this in the book, compromise laws that are put in place that really don't actually address at source the damaging or destructive practices. I mean, in particular, reference to paint. Unless you can actually eat your paint, then obviously you're going to have chemicals on your hands that really aren't going to do you or your immediate environment any good at all. You know, I would recommend linseed paint, for instance, which is very popular in Scandinavian countries. That you can actually eat and you'll be fine. And that's a rule of thumb for me. It's the same with chemicals that are inside, women's products. I won't put anything on my skin that has on the back of the bottle something I actually don't understand. Why would I want to put some chemicals on my body when my body will inevitably soak up at least 60% of that? And that includes what I breathe in as well. So trying to control my own environment is hugely important, but it does mean being informed at the end of the day. And that means then that the onus is on the consumer to get themselves up to speed rather than the other way around.
Right.
And that means that, in fact, whose interests are being protected here? The consumers or ultimately the corporations? And at the moment, it's the corporations who have the right to pollute, the silent rights to emit, to cause damage. And we need to shift that completely so that, in fact, it's protection of the wider society, not just humans, but the wider community as a whole. We need that very definite shift to happen now.
Well, I'm delighted that you're working on it. I will tell you something that frightened me last week that happened. Something passed in Congress here that requires all of us to replace our light bulbs with a mercury-laden light bulb that we are now going to be forced to use. Now, I have to tell you, I am so into health and wellness, and I have a dedication and commitment to that. That means I'm into what's in our water, what do we drink, what's in our air, what do we use on our body, exactly like what you said. But we're being forced to use a certain type of light bulb now. Now, when you put this together and find out that GE is part of the cap and trade system, and that GE worked with one of the people in Enron, and that the head of JP Morgan Chase, who created the derivatives market, by the way, a woman, was part of the architect of the cap and trade system. I must have done, 15 pieces on everything you ever want to know about finance. From credit default swaps to derivatives to high-frequency trading. I mean, when I go in, I go in. But this is the part to me that you can have the greatest commitment to the stewardship of the planet. And yet, if you look at the people, where they've come from, and what their influences have been, what their consciousness is, you have to look at the detail of who's involved. Why is GE involved in the cap and trade system? Why? Why are we being told we cannot use anything other than these next mercury-laden light bulbs? See, that's not okay. And it's not just about carbon. It's about way more than carbon. That's an issue that is going to affect the health of billions of people across the world. We have forced fluoridation of our water here in California. And the reality is, when I was a young girl, fluoride was promoted by the Dental Society being very, very good for your teeth. Well, 30 years or 40 years have gone by, and we find out totally new information on the role of fluoride as a neurotoxin. But the agencies here will not allow that information to be made public knowledge unless you go digging for it. You don't know it. So kids are getting it. Our baby food has been infiltrated. We have genetically modified foods. I don't even get to know when I shop, Polly, am I eating a genetically modified fruit? They're not telling me. And they're totally different. Totally different. So there is a whole systems paradigm, which you're talking about, that needs to encompass everything. Everything. And I hope that you are able to somehow create the instruments where corporations cannot get away from the accountability. And it doesn't matter how much money they have. They can't pay off the judges. They can't pay off the court system. They cannot pay off high officials because it won't matter. Somehow, this instrument and this paradigm impacts and integrates into everything. It's scary to be alive now. I'm going to be told what kind of light bulb I have to use. And they're only looking at one piece, which is this connection with the carbon. But they're not looking at the fact that it has mercury in it. I did a whole show, by the way, about light, everything you want to know about light. It was the most fascinating piece. I will send you links to it, to all these things I'm telling you about. But the reality is the light that is being emitted can impact our creativity, can expand our energy, or it can totally deplete you. So it's very important that if something is going to be regulated, they better be regulating something that's going to enhance people's well-being and not the other. And that's my issue with regulations. It's not whole systems. It's a piece. No. It's just a little small piece of something, like when you look at the spokes on a wheel, it's a spoke. It's not the core. The core would be taking into consideration everything: agriculture, air, the ability to choose your own form of medicine, your own form of life extension, etc. There are people that are dying of cancer that can never get different types of remedies other than chemo and radiation. And they have to fly all over the world to save their lives. So to me, there's a whole systems legal structure that needs to be tended to. Obviously, you're working on it. How is it going so far?
Well, it's good. And I think you've hit on a really important point here. Buckminster Fuller used a term back in the 50s, which was we need a trim tab.
Exactly.
And a trim tab, for those of you who don't know what that is, it's actually the button that's used very often on cruise liners, that if you were to press this button, it connects down to a wire which takes it out to the udder at the back. And what it does is it turns something just very tiny, but by doing that, then it turns all the other cogs, which then the whole boat, as a result, can turn. But the energy that's expended to press that button, that initial button, the trim tab button, is nominal. It's just pushing your finger. But you can turn the whole
ship
liner around. That is a trim tab, and we're needing that just now. We're needing the trim tabs that can turn around the whole situation here. And this is where an international crime of ecocide really comes into its own. It is a trim tab on so many levels. By creating, first of all, an international crime of ecocide, first of all, it's international because, of course, an awful lot of damage and destruction that's done to the planet can start in one place. Pollution can be airborne or waterborne and end up in another. Hence, we have Inuit mothers breastfeeding babies and discovering that they have DDT in their breast milk, even though DDT is now banned. And the DDT that's been used in America or Britain, 20, 30 years ago. So it's addressing the internationality of it, but also the criminality aspect, but also this idea of it being damage, destruction to, or loss of ecosystems. So it's a very holistic approach. It's looking at the whole. It's seeing humans as part of an ecosystem. So as part of an ecosystem within a given community, and that community not just being humans, but the land, the soils, the waters, the trees, the whole environment. And by putting something like that in place, then as an overarching umbrella piece of legislation that supersedes everything else, then what you have is all other laws will have to come into line with it. And it means that certain laws will have to either go or be amended to come into line with that. Very important that we have something that's a trim tab that can turn everything that's still creating huge, huge problems elsewhere.
That's a brilliant analogy of the trim tab. And yet here's the thing. Somebody told me about 2 years ago, if you do not form a treaty, this thing has to be formed at the level of an international treaty. Maybe it's an earth treaty. I don't know. But basically what I've been told is that on a treaty level, countries can just agree and do whatever they're going to do. They just do their business via treaty. And they can bypass all this other regulation, all these other laws. It's like this upper echelon or gestalt of activity. How do you see dealing with treaties that often bypass things that are agreed upon? Because they can do something by treaty.
We already have the treaty in existence that needs amending to add an ecocide. So that's called the Rome Treaty. And the Rome Treaty was written in 1998. And what that did was it put in place the International Criminal Court, and that's the court that governs the 4 crimes against peace. And those 4 crimes are genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes of aggression. I'm saying all we need to do is we don't need to write a whole new treaty. We just amend the existing one, and we add a 5th crime against peace, that being ecocide. What is so important, however, yes, you've got a point there in saying that you can just write a treaty and nobody does anything about it. If you do not have an international court in which you can take action, then it is pointless. And that's the biggest problem with the Kyoto Protocol, that at the moment, where do you take action for all those countries that have failed to uphold their so-called binding limits? And in fact, all countries failed, bar one, which was Portugal last year. So, prima facie, you could say they should all be taken to court, but what court? There is no court really that's dealing with this. It certainly hasn't been written in as part of it. And it's not a crime, necessarily. So what we have here is we have 4 existing crimes that for the first time ever now have an international court. What happened was back in 1948 was the first international criminal court. That was the Nuremberg war trials. But of course that was specific to an incident, after the incident had happened. Once they had concluded business there, then it closed shop. It took us until 1998 to then put together and have ratified, have all countries, well, majority of countries sign up to the Rome Treaty to say, okay, now we will put in a permanent court. There have been a few ad hoc courts that have been put in after the event, like for Yugoslavia, But this now means that we have a permanent international criminal court in existence. So it's very new. The first case that actually commenced was in 1996. 1992, the court was put in place. 1996, they started their first case. They have four cases going on at the moment. So, but what we do know in those last 4 years is that it has been stupendously successful. It needs to be cranked up, without a doubt. It needs to be expanded. But we do now have somewhere we can go. And the beauty is that unlike the International Court of Justice, which deals with largely member state to member state disputes, largely over trade, the International Criminal Court is dealing with crimes, and that can be brought by either by recommendation of the Security Council through the UN, or it can be through a member state, or the prosecutor of their own volition can raise a case against an individual. And remember, it's against an individual, so it's a head of state, or it's a head of a corporation, or it's a head of an organization. Any individual can be taken here. Or a citizen of the world can write. And this is mainly what happens just now, is that people do write from African states asking for help. And that's how cases are then brought into the International Criminal Court. That is new. That is new. That is actually giving a voice to the people, a court where the people can raise their own issues, can actually go and ask that there's an investigation put in place so that an international crime can be investigated. And if there are breaches against either crimes against humanity, war crimes, a genocide, or crimes of aggression, that they can then be prosecuted.
Do you think, Polly, that everything related to ecocide has to work through the UN? Or do you think that this could be developed as a parallel path?
Well, this is the interesting thing. The UN is very beneficial because actually without the UN we wouldn't have any international crimes. Without the UN we wouldn't have an international criminal court. The United Nations is the only international body that exists that allows us to put in place international crimes. Take that out of the agenda, then you're trying to get a whole lot of countries to come together all over again without it coming under some body that is supposedly to represent the people. Because remember, the UN Charter was written on behalf and for the people, not for the corporations, not for the governments. And so, in a way, yes, it has its flaws, but it's a very good organization which just needs help itself to realize the ambitions of the citizenship at large, the global citizenship.
How do you envision, for example, the court that you're describing, this court that is going to be taking care of and dealing with ecocide? How do you see it not becoming what we call here a kangaroo court, where people can apply and you can go in, but what's done is a whole other issue? Very much like what's happening here with the Gulf Coast.
The beauty is with the International Criminal Court, it's certainly never been accused of being a kangaroo court. The judiciary is entirely independent, which is quite right. There have been calls, both here in Italy and Bolivia as well, for an international court of the environment. In fact, there's been a call for that for over 20 years. And that is another avenue that can be done. It doesn't have to be in the International Criminal Court. The beauty is without having the International Criminal Court is that it's an existing system. And that took 60 years to put in place.
Got it.
How long will it take us to put in place a brand new system? There is a certain amount of urgency here. And where we can use existing systems and extend them, and certainly existing systems that work, then I'm all in favour of that.
Sure,
if we get a new court up and running, well and good. But hey, if we can just extend what we've already got, it's already got its rules and procedures in place. It's already got independent judges that are sitting on cases. It's already got its roster of staff. It's already got the whole mechanisms clunking along, so to say. So to just amend and add yet another crime that they deal with is a very simple process. We don't have to invent a whole new treaty. We don't have to invent a whole new negotiation around it. It's a far faster process than climate negotiations. Climate negotiations it's done by consensus. So you have 197 countries plus all the negotiators, which ranges between 5 and 500 negotiators per country. So you're talking thousands of negotiators all have to agree. So, of course, nothing ever agrees. It is built to fail. Whereas if we're looking at an amendment through an existing treaty, it's a 2/3 vote. And it's one country, one vote. So whether or not you're the size of Kiribati or the size of America, it does not matter. You only have one vote.
Got it. I totally get what you said. How would you see then how the instrument that you're going to put in place regarding ecocide would deal with the U.S. Navy plans to decimate 11.7 million marine animals over the next 5 years in the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Gulf of Mexico? Based on what you're sharing with us, would navies be answerable to this? Would our military be accountable to this?
The beauty is that the whole concept of responsibility and indeed superior responsibility that was put in place by the Nuremberg trials is that whether you be a prince or a pauper, you cannot evade your responsibilities. So it doesn't matter, what you're heading up. You will be still liable for any damage or destruction that you cause. Now, with an international crime of ecocide, this is really about dealing with mass ecocide. So it's a matter of, what makes mass ecocide? Now, the beauty is we already have during wartime. So under war crimes, we already have a definition for damage and destruction to the environment, which talks about severity, size, geographical size, and duration. And that is actually defined in international law as being something that covers an area of 100 square kilometers, creates an impact that will last for more than 3 months. And that impact is severe, i.e. creates, either loss of life or huge hindrance to lives, and not just human life. So if you use that definition, which exists during wartime, then you would find that, for instance, the oil spill is a crime during war. But at the moment, it's not a crime during all time, normal time. So really what we're doing is we're extending a premise that already exists there for war, and that was a premise that was finally put in after the Vietnam War with the NMOD conventions, when it was recognized that we really cannot do this ever again. Huge destruction, ecosystem destruction there, and damage to humans as well. So we already have that. It's a very simple exercise to extend that, not just to wartime, but all time. And that then, we're not having to kind of reinvent our wheel completely, but we're reliant on what's there already. Of course, you can argue that ecocide happens on a far smaller scale, which indeed it does, but for the purposes of an international criminal court, we're looking at the grossest breaches, that they have to be dealt with first and foremost. On a national level, then it can be dealt with at a smaller level as well, without a doubt.
Do you have enemies? And if you do, it sounds like you will.
Well, the beauty is with having enemies over this is that they don't want to talk to you. So I haven't met many of them yet.
Uh-huh.
And Tony Hayward's probably not going to ever be my best friend.
Yeah. It's so funny. During the Gulf oil spill at the beginning, I think 30 days into it, I spoke with a gentleman who had done 50 deep water drills. And I wanted to do something that would help move things forward quickly. Instead of just talk about how bad it is, I wanted to move. I wanted to start potentiating solutions right away. And he shared exactly what needed to be done. He says, look, this is exactly what they need to do. Boom, 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 boom. Then somebody who, quote, had an environmental solution heard that interview and then heard the next one. And the next one was about who's accountable and the distinction between the general contractor and the subcontractors, where we name some of them and talk about this complex matrix of no accountability. The guy was going to do an interview, and he called me back, and he goes, I'm sorry, but my people have said we cannot have anything to do with you because we want to sell something to BP. I mean, literally, one night, really excited, wanting to come on the show, to we don't want anything to do with you. We want to distance ourselves from you. I said, are you kidding? Can you call upon your strength and stand up? You are being a guest. We don't all have to agree on everything.
But what they're concerned about is actually, well, A, their idea is not going to be taken on, but also B, being tied into some form of risk of litigation for being hooked into a call for accountability. This is again about not having sufficient provisions in there to protect whistleblowers and to understand that in fact whistleblowing is very important, and to be able to stand up to these the big corporations, big business, and say, look, you got to get to grip here, because if you don't, you're going to be slapped with imprisonable offences, which will make you take responsibility. And the world is moving that way. In a way, when you put out big ideas like Ecocide, there's no going back. The very first day I put it out on the internet, I did a Google search and I got 28 pages up on Ecocide. I just had a look this weekend to see how many pages we have now, and what's listed here is 111,000 pages. That's just within 3 months alone. So what we're seeing is this word. Now you can buy T-shirts all over the world and bumper stickers with BP, Ecocide, what have you. But nevertheless, people are actually starting to get to grips with the idea that there is massive destruction going to ecosystems here, and that this is wrong. And it's only one step from recognizing the morality of it as being wrong to then actually implementing it into law so that it really is stopped. Sadly, it ultimately always takes some form of disaster for us to have that put in place. But we are looking at that time now. We need to move very fast to ensure that this sort of thing doesn't happen again, because this is killing the seas. And ultimately, it has a huge knock-on impact on
habitat,
on humans as well. Yeah, all habitat, absolutely.
Here's the thing that's really driving a lot of people here in the United States crazy about this. It's bad enough that it happened in the Gulf Coast. It's bad enough that it has happened, and it's bad enough that it's going on. But what people have had a major issue with here is, aside from suffering about that and upset and worry about that, there has been a highly controlled ban with the media. Basically, BP's in charge. I mean, I do not understand. And by the way, this could be any president that allows any company that knowingly was using faulty equipment to work with no accountability, 700 fines. Why are they given authority in the Gulf Coast to run the project? I don't get it. Explain it to me.
Well, I'm not terribly sure I can, except to go back on the fact that it's complete failure of recognition of responsibility. And if you can't levy responsibility against an individual, then ultimately it's a corporation. This is no good. A piece of paper can never be put into prison. This is why it's so important through international crime that it's individuals that will be imprisoned. If you think you're going to go to prison, there's an awful lot you will suddenly no longer agree to do if it's risky. Banks just won't finance and bankroll big projects that could mean that their head of whichever bank has loaned money could end up in prison for having bankrolled an investment that is going to create ecocide. Likewise, governments will no longer put in place supporting policies for something that could create ecocide. So this really is about actually imposing responsibility, and it's preventative. I mean, the beauty is you put in an international crime such as this, you'll find that an awful lot of this activity stops overnight. You give a transition period for corporations to realign themselves, and of course, finance it, give them huge subsidies to do so. But of course, governments will be having to pool the subsidies that are propping up the damaging activity in the first place. So you're realigning your finance into that where it needs to go. And it really is innovation in a completely different direction then. Energy companies are just one example, but suddenly you'd be shifting from dirty energy to clean energy, for instance. And money would be freed up to do that. That's very important also. But without actually ascertaining or being able to impose upon someone direct responsibility for making decisions at top of organizations, we're pretty scuppered. And that's really where international crime comes into its own. It really does impose that responsibility once and for all.
What is the trust? The trust is an organization. Is that it, the Planet Earth Trust?
No, the Planet Earth Trust is really a way of trying to demonstrate to people how we can use trust laws to protect the planet. So I'm inviting anyone to come and join up on the site and become a trustee of the planet. Now, it really is actually a mindset, but in law we have trustees, and it's demonstrating how we can use laws to protect the planet, and in fact why we should be doing this. So for you to sign up and become a trustee, then you have duties and obligations. Any trustee of any organization has duties and obligations, and therefore responsibilities. And so it's basically saying, yes, I'm prepared to become a trustee of the planet Earth, and I'm prepared to uphold my duties and obligations to protect this planet. And I've set out various suggestions of what those duties and obligations are. But the important thing really here is for people to start shifting their approach to how they view the planet. If you view the planet as a thing, then you will ultimately put a price on it. You will impose a value on it. You will commoditize it. You will trade it. But if you view the planet as a living being, then you take responsibility. You see yourself in a stewardship role. You see the intrinsic value rather than imposing a price value and commoditizing it. And that's a very different approach. That's something that indigenous people understand at a very deep level.
Exactly.
Buddhists as well. The interesting thing is that I found out to my amazement there are 380 million indigenous people living on this planet who are living as indigenous people. Not just sitting in a city and saying, okay, I'm indigenous, but actually living off the land as their ancestors did. And Buddhists, there are 370 million Buddhists in the world. And of course, for them, it's a way of life not to abuse the planet and certainly do not view the planet as a thing, but as a living being and accord it respect and reverence. And what I realized was that, in fact, you take just those two groups of people together, that's over 750 million people. That's the size of Europe. The size of Europe already gets this, So how come when we've got so many people in this world living this way, and it's not just Buddhists or indigenous people, there are people living in their cities as well and what have you that really get this at a very deep level and are essentially applying these principles into their own life. How come we're not doing this on a larger scale? And in fact, why don't we do it at a larger scale? Why is it that we are treating the planet as a piece of property when we can actually make it a trust? So trusts are legally binding instruments. And my idea is that, in fact, if we get even more people signed up to this concept, then arguably you can say that, in fact, by dint of numbers alone, this is the preeminent law to apply, rather than saying, okay, what was called terra nullius, no one lives in this patch, and those locals will ignore them. We'll just put our stake in here and put our flag up and say, okay, it's now ours, and we'll write up a contract and say this now is ours, we own it, and we'll rubber stamp it, and therefore we've imposed an ownership on it. This is a very human-made construct. To actually say we have ownership. Ownership per se is a very strange idea, which was born of, unfortunately, lawyers. But if we step back and actually look at guiding principles that really are nature's own laws, then we understand it more in terms of trusteeship, stewardship.
I had a very interesting experience after my father died in 2003. I was sitting in my parents' home, and there were strangers in the house going through boxes and packing up all the stuff. And I had this profound insight watching my dad go through all kinds of struggles in his life about how successful he is or how much he owns or how good he did and the whole thing. I sat there in the living room thinking, for what? All that suffering, all that concern, all that worry to own, and it's all gone. It doesn't go with him. It really puts into perspective what you're saying, which is that we are stewards.
Yeah.
We own nothing. And I believe in my heart, on my 25-year mission, that ownership and that construct is one of the foundational elements for suffering for all of humanity. Owning and territoriality is part of the seeds of destruction of why a lot of things are going on all over the earth, from GMO foods to bad medical practices to the pharmaceutical companies getting to run the show, of all medicine, of life extension, of anti-age, of everything. And this, as you know, goes to every single industry, everywhere. And it was this profound moment of getting that it's ridiculous. This thing about ownership, the need to own. I understand having dominion and stewarding something and needing to make sure it works in a particular way. But this thing of ownership is craziness. And we are living in the manifestation of this paradigm.
Yes, absolutely. And what we're needing to do is change the paradigm and really change it radically. It's not about incremental little bit by little bit. If you look at shifts in consciousness over time, what happens is you get a certain build and then, poof, suddenly everything changes. The abolition of slavery is really telling in this. Back here in the UK, our main proponent who gave up his life to fight for the abolition of slavery was William Wilberforce. And he fought that battle the whole of his life. Literally 2 days before he died, they put in the laws that banished slavery. But what was so interesting was that from the year before that law was put in to the year after it, it was a huge shift in consciousness. Prior to the law being put in, it was absolutely acceptable to have a black in chains. But a year after, it was not. It was just not the done thing. Now, that's not to say that we don't have slavery in other muted forms nowadays, but the liberation of actually having someone that was a piece of property, because of course ultimately that's what slaves were. They were your property to use and abuse as you so wished, had gone. And that shift in consciousness was truly enormous, and law effected that shift. Because William Wilberforce realized very early on that it was pointless to go around everyone who had a slave. About 6 million people had slaves then. And say, look, would you mind awfully just using your slave a little less? That's akin to energy efficiency. Because actually slaves were a form of energy. It's just human energy. Right. You know, they lifted our things, they moved everything. And they've been replaced with, fossil fuel energy, which, gives us the energy to use all our vehicles and such like. But he knew that it was no point going around and saying, okay, can you implement 10% efficiency rules here? He knew that you actually have to go upstream to the source of the problem, to the companies. Then it was 300 companies. Now it's 3,000 corporations. The numbers even are in tandem here. 300 companies that were trading in slaves, and he realized there were three things needed to be done. You needed to pool the subsidies. Slavery was heavily subsidized. In fact, it was the plantations. Sugar plantations were the first monocrop that we had, and they were heavily subsidized because they needed lots of slaves to work in them. You have to pool the subsidies. You have to make illegal that which is wrong, which for him it was human slavery. And you have to put in place new subsidies It's not about putting the corporations out of business, but it's about getting them to reinvent the wheel. And within a year, all those ones that were trading in slaves were trading in tea in China. And, they all argued 4 arguments that were put. And those 4 arguments were, it will mean loss of jobs if you get rid of our slave trade. It's uneconomic. It's a necessity, and the people demand it. Those are the same 4 arguments that are being put today for keeping fossil fuel. And fossil fuel is essentially a form of slavery. But this time round, it's planetary slavery that we have.
It's profound. I know that you said you only had an hour for today, and an hour is a long time, and I so appreciate you joining me. I wanted to invite you, as time opens up for you, to come back on the show as we talk about other issues. I just really appreciate you coming here.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate you coming on the show, and I wish Anita Roddick was alive today, because I'd love to sit with you and her in London. Maybe Gordon, you and I can sit down in a studio and talk and see what can be done. Have you met Gordon?
She's a very good woman. Yes, I do. Yes. He's a very good man. And he's fighting good causes too.
So, Polly Higgins, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to find out more about Polly's work, you can go to www.treeshaverights2.com. Polly, thank you so much.
Thank you, Kim. It's been an absolute delight.
Say it's rainmaking time, will you? It's rainmaking time.
It's rainmaking time.
Indeed it is.